Yes, start.
A warm good evening to our guest speaker, our beautiful and curious audience, and all my friends. I, Harshit Khandelwal, the host for today, welcome you all to this special coherence lecture, jointly presented by Pravega 21 and LIGO India EPO. Coherence Lecture Series being an initiative of Pravega Decoherence team, bringing deemed researchers to express and talk about their work. LIGO India EPO is the education and public outreach arm of LIGO India, indeed, which is a planned advanced gravitational wave observatory to be located in India. When the early human cave came out of his cave and looked at the night sky, he was wonderstruck by the beauty and curiously wondered what happened in the heavens. Hundreds of thousands of years later, the curiosity has remained the same. Just our eyes have gotten the ability to look at not just electromagnetic waves, visible light, but gravitational waves as well. Such elusive phenomena have been discovered by our multiple eyes, one of which is what our esteemed speaker is going to talk about. A fellow lover of the cosmos, Dr. Varun Bhalerao is an astrophysicist at IIT Bombay. He obtained a B.Tech in electrical engineering at IIT Bombay, followed by a PhD from Caltech in 2012. During his thesis, he worked on NuSTAR, a first focusing hard X-ray telescope, a Caltech JPL and NASA mission. He also studied high mass X-ray binaries with optical and infrared telescopes to measure neutron star masses. As a Vaidya Roy Chaudhary Prize postdoctoral fellow at IUCAA Pune, he led the ground calibration of the zinc cadmium telluride imager on AstroSat. Those are a lot of elements, I must say. The AstroSat being the Indian Multi-Wavelength Space Telescope. At IIT Bombay, his group works on the development of Growth India, India's first fully robotic telescope. This group leads the Indian effort in the study of elusive electromagnetic counterparts to gravitational wave sources. So before we actually begin, I'd like our audience to put all the queries you have in between in the Q&A box, and I'll read them out in the Q&A part at the end. So, coming with the topic, cosmic fireworks, shining light on gravitational wave sources, put your digital hands together for Dr. Varun Bhalerao.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for such a nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you and to virtually be at IISc, a fantastic campus with great activity and great research going on. Today, I'm going to talk to you guys about, to all of you, about cosmic fireworks and shining light on gravitational wave sources. So, what you see here is our fantastic telescope, the Growth India telescope at our site in Hanle, Ladakh. And we will hear a bit more about this telescope in the end, but you can see a beautiful Milky Way rising there in this time lapse, which was created by postdoctoral fellow Shubham Srivastav at IIT Bombay. So let's talk about gravitational waves first, right? The name is quite a mouthful, shining light on gravitational wave sources. So what are gravitational waves and what do we want to do with these sources? So gravitational waves, as you may have heard, are sometimes described as ripples in space-time. So what I'm going to show you here is this idea. We will not go into a lot of detail about understanding gravitational waves itself. There was another lecture held by Professor Shomak Raichaudhuri about a week ago in which he described this in great detail. But here's the basic idea. Space-time is often denoted as if it were a fabric. And Einstein's general theory of relativity told us that mass, the presence of any massive object in space, actually distorts the space around it. And it also told us that it's not just space that we should think about, space and time together form a four-dimensional entity called space-time. So what is shown here is you could imagine that these lines which are being marked are actually showing a flat grid of space-time, and once there is an object there, that grid actually gets distorted. Now, if you have a second object around it, so this very nice animation from PhD Comics shows that if you have a second object around it, then this object actually now ends up orbiting the first one because of the distortions in space-time that we had here. So let me go back to that animation. So the second object, as it is trapped in this curved space-time around the first one, ends up orbiting the first object. Now this is where things get interesting. If I have two objects, as are shown here, they have both distorted space-time around them. And if now they start orbiting each other, their positions in space are going to change, which means that the distortions in space-time around those objects will also have to move along with them. So imagine, if you would, a boat that is on the flat surface of water. What happens is that the surface of the boat actually causes a distortion in the otherwise flat surface of the water. Now, if the boat starts moving, then that distortion moves with the boat, and as a result, you end up creating waves on the surface of that pond. A very similar conceptually thing is happening here. As these two objects start moving around, the distortions that they had induced in space-time around them also start moving around, and you can see the entire fabric of space-time itself is rippling, and that, loosely speaking, is what gravitational waves are. So here's the animation again, two objects moving around each other and the distortions in space-time spread out. Now here's a very important part. These waves are not like light waves or sound waves. Okay, sound is waves, light is waves, waves on oceans are waves, but they are all very different kinds of waves. So gravitational waves again are a very different kind of waves, and we cannot see them with our eyes. We cannot measure them with our microphones. What we need in order to detect them is very specialized gravitational wave detectors. So here is a fly past of the gravitational wave detector LIGO Hanford. There's a central cabin which you are seeing, and there are two very long arms which are 4 kilometers in length, and lasers are fired from this central cabin. My animations really are misbehaving today. Okay, so lasers are fired from this central cabin going along both the arms, and at the end you see these cabins again where there are heavy mirrors suspended. So here we are flying towards one of these end cabins, and mirrors suspended at this point reflect lasers which are shining from the central station to these end stations, and that light comes back. And this is something called an interferometer. Some of you who are from a physics background may have done these kind of experiments in your BSc, called basic interferometric experiments. And what this allows us to do is very precisely measure the length of these two arms. How precisely? Well, the distortions that are caused by gravitational waves, the amount that the surface of the mirror moves is thousands of times smaller than the diameter of a proton. So extremely fine changes. If I go and add one drop of water into the ocean, then the height change in the entire ocean of the world will be about this much. So that's how fine an effect we are trying to measure. And these experiments, these gravitational wave detectors, have been under construction and upgrades for many years. And finally, in 2015, we discovered the first gravitational waves, and these were coming from a pair of massive black holes. Okay, since then we have been able to see many black holes merging with each other. So here is a set of animations of various sources that have been discovered by LIGO, and you can see that these are actually being shown as renderings. Black holes don't look blue. What is being plotted at the bottom is the kind of signal that was detected by gravitational wave detectors, and you can see there were two black holes here which came closer and closer to each other, and then they finally merged. The dates that are written here, GW 1512, refers to a gravitational wave event in 2015 on 10th, 1210. So this, for instance, is 26 December 2015. Okay. Now, if we were actually close by to these sources and somehow magically managed to not get ripped apart by the extreme gravitational fields of the black holes, then what we would see is not this. What we would see is probably more like this. You can notice that there are two black holes here. The black holes themselves don't emit any light. They're completely black. But what is happening is that as the two black holes move, the light that is coming to us from stars behind those black holes is actually getting distorted. It's getting lensed. And as a result of that, we see this very wobbly image of the background star field. And then finally, those two black holes merged. You can still see there is activity happening in a ring around that source. This is called the Einstein ring. And you are seeing a gravitationally lensed image of different parts of the background star field here. In practice, what we detected was a signal that got plotted on a computer screen. And when we actually, if we were to point our telescopes, our conventional telescopes at it, here is what we would see. Don't worry, it's not your connection that has blanked out. We would actually see absolutely nothing. These sources are very, very far away, and this merger that happened here did not emit any light. So as a result, these detections do not emit any uh, radio waves, X-rays, gamma rays, optical light, UV, absolutely nothing. Now, when you think of astrophysics, you usually tend to think of telescopes and observing with them. So how do we actually reconcile this? Well, merging black holes are just one type of sources of gravitational waves. There are actually several other sources that can be there. So gravitational waves, broadly speaking, there are things called, for instance, continuous gravitational wave sources. So there are these extremely compact objects called neutron stars. A neutron star is something that is about the mass of the sun, or maybe up to twice the mass of the sun, and it is extremely compact. The diameter is barely 20 to 30 kilometers, so it's about the size of a large city. And if these neutron stars have any slight asymmetry in them, then as they are spinning, then they will start emitting gravitational waves. So that's called continuous gravitational waves. Or if there are any massive explosions in space, like supernova explosions, stars which are 20, 30 times heavier than the sun, at the end of their life, they die in a massive supernova explosion. And there are hints that there are some asymmetries in that. So if there's a supernova explosion, that could emit gravitational waves. And of course, there could be fun things. There could be completely unknown areas, things which we have not even dreamt of yet, which might be just lurking out there in the universe, and we might detect something that is completely unknown. But what has been detected so far are these classes of merging binaries, where broadly what these ground-based gravitational wave detectors are sensitive to are merging black holes. So a black hole merging with another black hole, like the series of animations we saw, or we could have a black hole merging with a neutron star. And now here things get interesting. A neutron star actually has a surface. A black hole doesn't even have a surface. There is just something called the event horizon, and anything that crosses the event horizon, we never see or hear from ever again. Light cannot cross out beyond the event horizon. Neutron stars, on the other hand, we detect them regularly. We see them usually, they are studied in optical and radio and X-rays, but we have also studied these neutron stars in all other wavelengths of light that you can think of. Or there could even be two neutron stars, and if they merge, then in the process we can actually detect light coming from their surfaces and from the explosion that happens when they merge with each other. So for the rest of this talk, I'm mainly going to focus on this class. I'm mainly going to focus on neutron star mergers. Okay, so what do we want to do with all of this? Do we want to observe this just because it's fun, just because I like to see something with my telescopes? No, we are trying to do all of this to actually understand our universe. Gravitational waves, as the name suggests, are waves in gravity. And gravity, as we all know, comes from mass, right? This is what we learned right from Newton, that every massive body attracts every other massive body around it. So gravitational waves will tell you about the masses or the dynamics of the system. How heavy were they? How far were they from each other? How were they spinning about around each other? Where were they located in the sky? How far away? And you can also understand some other properties of the orbit. Was the orbit like this, so that it was edge onto you, or was it perpendicular? It was in the plane of the sky, perpendicular to your line of sight. On the other hand, light comes from the surface of an object. So it will actually tell us properties that are closer to the surface. We can talk about, we can of course figure out exactly where the things were in the sky. Okay, think of it this way. If you hear the sound of an airplane, then you can say, okay, it is roughly in that part of the sky. And gravitational wave detectors actually localize or figure out where a source is on the sky using a very similar method as your brain uses to figure out, based on inputs from your 2 ears, where a source of sound is. On the other hand, if you look there and you see an airplane, you can locate it a lot more precisely. So our electromagnetic telescopes at all wavelengths have much higher image quality. They are much sharper, so we can get the precise location of where a source is on the sky. We can also figure out properties about what was the ejecta, what was thrown out by this explosion, how fast was it moving, how much was it, what kind of elements were found. There's a lot of nuclear fission and fusion that goes on, mainly fusion in such explosions. And we can understand all of that. So it's only after combining these two different windows to the universe, these two different messengers, as we call them, can we actually understand the complete astrophysics of what was happening at the source. So that is why we want to study the electromagnetic counterparts of the gravitational wave sources, EM and GW going hand in hand. What is the astrophysics more precisely that we will learn from this? Or another way that you would want to ask a question to a scientist is what keeps you up at night? I'm an astrophysicist. Everything keeps me up at night. That's my job. But in particular, let me talk about two questions that I am most interested in answering. So the first question is, where are all the heavy metals in the universe formed? Now, astronomers are actually quite lazy about counting this. Okay, our periodic table says there's hydrogen, helium, and everything else is a metal. So if you are talking to an astronomer, carbon and oxygen would be called metals. Don't attempt doing this in your chemistry class. Your teachers will not like it. Okay, so where are all these heavy metals found? But here I am referring to really the heaviest elements in the periodic table. And the second question is, what is the equation of state of ultra dense matter? So let's actually probe this in a bit more detail. Okay, so you may have heard this quote that we are all made of stardust. And this color coded periodic table here is actually going to show you exactly how. Okay, so hydrogen and helium that we see, so hydrogen up here and helium, most of them were completely formed in the Big Bang. All of the hydrogen that is present in the universe was just completely made in the Big Bang, and most of the helium as well. But if you now start looking at things which make us up, for example, all the oxygen that you are breathing was actually created by the explosion of massive stars. And the carbon in your body and the nitrogen which makes up the bulk of the Earth's atmosphere were all created again in dying stars, some of them in massive dying stars, some of them in low mass dying stars. Okay, and as you come down, you start seeing a lot of purple color here. Okay, and some rather interesting elements that some of you might like are present in this purple color. There is platinum, there's gold, there's silver. Okay, and all of these, if you look at the legend here, these were created from merging neutron stars. So what we just talked about, two neutron stars spiraling around each other, they merge, and in the process there is something called R process nucleosynthesis that takes place. We have a lot of neutrons which are trapped under gravity, and when these two massive neutron stars collide, then those neutrons start undergoing fission and creating elements, and most of these elements, including a large fraction of lanthanides and actinides that you see, were created in such processes. Okay, so how exactly do you make gold? So you start with a universe, you form large hydrogen stars, and in those stars at the core you have fusion going on, and that fusion is actually creating elements. So you synthesize what astronomers called metals, and then these massive stars have to explode, and then you spread those metals around. So now the universe, astronomers call this contamination. Universe is now contaminated with metals. Now you use these ashes to make up next generation stars. So the sun, for example, is actually such a second generation star. The iron that you have on Earth was clearly not produced by the sun. It was produced by some other star that came before the sun. So now from these next generation stars, you again have to blow up these stars, and then you leave behind these neutron stars at the center. Okay, so we have started with some gas, we have made a star, killed it, it was reborn as a star, we have killed it again, and we are still not done. Okay, so now what you do is you take these two neutron stars, you collide them together again, and this collision most likely gives us black holes. Okay, it is an open question as to whether they still can create a massive neutron star, but most likely what we get as a remnant is a black hole. And now once you have this black hole, as a side effect of all of this, in the collision of the two neutron stars, you'll create some gold by nuclear fusion and spread it around as a side effect. Small amounts by cosmic standards, but by human standards, a lot. A single explosion like this can create gold several times the mass of the Earth. So these are very, very extreme events that we are talking about. But this really is going into Rajnikant territory here, right? The same star killed thrice in order to create gold. The other part is the equation of state of matter. Some of you may have seen diagrams like this. This is called the phase diagram for water. So there is temperature on one axis, there is pressure on one axis, and you're familiar with this. If I take at 1 atmospheric pressure, I take ice and I start heating it up, then what's going to happen is that at around 0 degrees Celsius, it's going to melt, and then at 100 degrees Celsius, it is going to boil. But this overall idea of the relation between the density and the pressure and the temperature of an object is called the equation of state. Okay, you may have heard about gas laws, for example, PV equal to nRT, or the phase diagram of water. But these are about objects that are just seen around us, right? Everyday life stuff. What about the equation of state of the most extreme cases? What is the equation of state of extremely ultra dense matter? What happens if I take matter to densities which are a factor of 2 above the density even in the nuclei of atoms? So if we put together all of this, then how do we actually want to measure this equation of state? How do we understand it? How do we characterize it? Right? And knowing this equation of state matters because it is important when we are trying to make our own stable, when we are trying to synthesize exotic elements, when we are trying to build reactors, trying to figure out which kind of nuclear fuels would work best. All of this information matters. Now, usually in physics, you would want to do experiments for anything that you are trying to observe or measure, right? So what kind of experiments would we do? Well, if we are talking of particle physics, then what you would do is you would actually collide particles together and then you would study the aftermath of it. You would try to understand what the collision resulted in. And by doing stuff like this, people have discovered the constituents of atoms, for instance. And then, of course, you can step it up. You can collide bunches of particles. This is what the Large Hadron Collider does. And this is how the Higgs boson, for instance, was discovered. And many, many other particles, subatomic particles. But come on, we are talking about astronomical scales here, right? So instead of taking just bunches of particles, how about I take 3 into 10 raised to 57 particles, right? That's 3 followed by 57 zeros here. And then I collide all of them together. Sounds insane. That's far more particles than are present on all of Earth or even in the entire solar system. But fortunately, we don't have to do this experiment ourselves. These experiments are done naturally in the universe. And this is exactly what happened in 2017. It had happened millions of years ago. We detected in 2017. So the animation here is showing 2 neutron stars that are spinning around each other. Shown in blue here is the artist's rendering of gravitational waves. Gravitational waves don't look blue, but we wouldn't see them. They are not light waves, so they have just been rendered here. And as the neutron stars were spinning around each other because they were emitting gravitational waves, the system was losing energy. So the neutron stars actually came closer to each other with every revolution. And then finally they actually collided. There was a massive explosion. It ended up launching these 2 jets. It created a cloud of debris around it, which is where a lot of fusion was going on, a lot of nucleosynthesis. The synthesis of nuclei was going on. Then it formed this disk. The jet actually went out, propagated to very, very large distances, and then it interacted with material around where it mushroomed out. So these kind of effects actually happened naturally. And this event happened on 17th of August 2017. So we call it GW 170817. Okay, so this was the first direct detection of gravitational waves from merging binary neutron stars. What I've shown here in the bottom panel is the signal as LIGO saw it. So as a function of time, time is negative because we have said t equal to 0 was when the merger happened. Okay, so as a function of time, the frequency of these sources actually started increasing and then they merged. And then just about 1.7 seconds later, two space telescopes, one called Fermi and one called Integral, actually saw a little blip in gamma rays in their detectors. Okay, so you can see that this is the approximate typical level of radiation that is seen, shown by the red line in all these three plots. And then after the merger, you see a spike here, starting at roughly the gray line and then peaking a little bit later. Okay, so this event, this is a big deal. We immediately swung into action. This happened in the evening by Indian time, and I remember immediately messaging my students saying we need to get to work. This is what we've been waiting for. And it was not just us who had been waiting for this. All around the world, as this happened, people swung into action, and this was a frenzy of observing. Okay, so you can, the red and the green dots that you see here are optical and radio telescopes which are taking observations. And you can see that time has been sped up here. Each second is 0.2 days right now. And in India, GMRT, the Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope, is taking observations. There's a telescope in Antarctica that observed. Telescopes on all continents actually took data. You can see most of the telescopes that are observing are located in the south because this event was in the southern sky. And you can also see that radio telescopes can happily observe during daytime, but optical and infrared telescopes, the ones shown in red, they start taking their observations as soon as the sun sets. Okay, and this keeps going on and on. We image this object for months on end. And in fact, the latest data that was taken with some ground and space telescopes was taken well over a year after the event happened, because we wanted to see how this thing keeps changing over time. Okay, and here it is. Yes.
So one participant actually asked in slide 17, what are the time scales involved?
The time scale is actually shown here. So, okay, there's a very large range of time scales that is involved here. Okay, first is that you have to form the stars and they have to evolve and die and form neutron stars. That typically takes tens of millions of years. Once you have formed these two neutron stars, they have to inspiral and merge. From the start till the final merger can take a few billion years. In the band that is detectable by LIGO, you can see that the time scale here was tens of seconds. Okay, if I remember correctly, the event was visible in the LIGO band, in the LIGO sensitivity region, frequency region, for about 100 seconds or so. Okay, the merger itself is tricky to define, because you could say that it started right from the formation of those two neutron stars, but easier way is to think about how we detected it, and that lasted for 100 plus seconds. So that's the time scale involved. By the way, some of you might notice that I have labeled the y-axis here in frequency in hertz, and this goes from 50 to 400 hertz. Now it turns out that LIGO, these detectors are actually sensitive in a range from about 10-20 hertz to about a few kilohertz, which happens to be the same as human audio range. It does not mean that gravitational waves are sound waves. For example, when I'm speaking right now, what is coming from my laptop to you is not sound. What is happening is my laptop is taking this sound, converting it into an electronic signal, which then is going over Wi-Fi as a radio signal, then probably passing as an optical light signal through fiber optic cables coming to your homes wherever you're watching. And your computer finally is receiving an electromagnetic signal, and that is being converted back into a sound wave by your computer. Similarly, what we measure in LIGO, if we want, we can actually convert it into sound, and this here would, we call it a chirp, because it would sound like whoop, and that is about it. So you can go online, you can look it up, and you'll find recordings of what this would have sounded like. That does not mean someone is actually sitting with earphones trying to listen to these signals. But just for fun, for outreach, we actually have created, the LIGO Scientific Collaboration has created apps where you can actually try to listen to those signals and find them out. All right, so here is the detection itself. Let's look at this image, a beautiful image from DECam. What you see here is a galaxy, okay, a bright core, and you can see a faint halo around here. A bunch of stars that you see are actually stars in our own Milky Way galaxy. And this source here, which you see in all of these images, okay, this is a new source that was discovered in that part of the sky right after the LIGO explosion. You can see that the first image was obtained about 11 hours by the SWOPE project, and then there are others which image this as well. Okay, so one important point here is you can look at the difference in data quality here. Okay, when we think of astronomical images, we are usually very impressed by images that you would see in magazines or online. Often they are taken by something like the Hubble Space Telescope, but we don't always have the luxury of having that quality of data. Okay, even in this, where by eye you can't actually make out where the signal is, we actually do a lot of image processing to be able to find out what was seen here. Okay, so these are the discovery images. We did not just go around imaging it. We took spectra. We observed it with GMRT in India, for example, the Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope, which is located midway between Pune and Nasik. We used a bunch of space telescopes and so on. Okay, what I'm showing here is the optical and infrared spectrum of this source. So you're used to thinking of a spectrum as light passing through a prism getting split out into colors. So this region here roughly is the human visible band, okay, going from about 0.4 microns to 0.7 microns. And then we have near infrared. And what is plotted here is intensity as a function of this wavelength. Okay, so this right now 1.5 days after the explosion was a blue hot source. But as we go forward from there, okay, the source slowly started cooling and slowly became redder and redder. Okay, this is again something which you have thought of or experienced. When something is cold and you start heating it, first becomes red hot, then orange, then yellow, and so on. Okay, and you see that the spectrum is not smooth. There are all these bumps and wiggles that we can see here and there. And these are all extremely important signs for us, because each of this little wiggle corresponds to some kind of element that is present in the source, which is absorbing that light or emitting light at a particular wavelength. And these per se are the fingerprints of the elements that were present in the source. Okay, so there were three things that astrophysicists or physicists all over the world found here. First is that the full collaboration, the LIGO collaboration, found a gravitational wave event. The second thing was that the Fermi and integral satellites actually saw a high energy flash somewhere in the sky. And the third thing that happened was ground-based telescopes and later space telescopes imaged this new point source in the galaxy, which was not seen there just a few days ago. But that does not mean they are the same thing. We actually had to now work hard to figure out if they really were three aspects of the same source. And how would we do that? Well, first let us look at the gravitational wave trigger and the high energy trigger. Okay, now the first thing is, what are the chances that your telescopes will detect some random burst of gamma rays at the same time as the gravitational wave event? You would say, wait a minute, it wasn't at the same time. There was actually a difference of about 1.7 seconds, as you just said. And that is right. So based on theoretical models, various groups had decided that roughly 100-second window would be acceptable as the maximum difference between when the gravitational waves arise and arrive at Earth and when the X-rays or gamma rays from that source arrive at Earth. Okay, so a day has 86,000 seconds. 100-second window in one day is roughly 1 part in 1,000. Now, these are not the only spikes that we see. We see explosions called gamma ray bursts, which come from either collisions of neutron stars like this or from explosions of massive stars of a certain type. And all the satellites in the world put together, including India's own AstroSat, detect about one such event per day. Okay, so the odds of getting a random such event in that 100-second window are roughly 1 per 1,000. So 1 per 1,000 could sound like pretty good odds, but we can do better. Okay, LIGO told us that, yeah, the source came from roughly that part of the sky, and then Fermi and integral together could also localize the source to about 1,000th of the sky again. And those two localizations, where LIGO said the source was the source that emitted gravitational wave, and where the satellites say that the X-rays and gamma rays came from were actually exactly the same part in the sky. So the odds of that are again 1 in 1,000. So together, the probability, the chance that we saw a gravitational wave event and a completely unrelated high energy event were just 1 in a million. Those are extremely good odds. And that is how we could conclude that they are actually the same. Now, what about the afterglow? What was seen by optical telescopes, the images and so on? So we think of the universe as unchanging, but that is not quite true. Okay, there are a lot of things that happen in the universe. It's just that they usually happen on timescales much longer than human timescales. A star lives for millions of years before dying, maybe billions of years. Supernovae happen from certain types of stars, which typically live for a 10 to 100 million year kind of period, or few tens of millions. But if I keep looking at millions of stars, then it means that every now and then I will actually watch one of them die. And those are supernovae, or there are other things. Stars show flares, there are novae. So we have detected a lot of these varying sources in the sky. We call them transients because they are transient in nature. They are seen only for a small duration and then they just disappear. But the important thing is that this source seemed to have appeared right at the time when the gravitational wave event happened, right at the time as in it wasn't now within few seconds, but the last we saw it was we had looked at that was a day or two before and there was nothing there. So new source roughly in the same time window. But what was very, very important is that when we studied this source, when we took spectra and so on, it matched the theoretical expectations very well. It was not like any other transient that we are used to dealing with, and it matched what we think such a transient should look like. So that put together allowed us to conclude again that what we were seeing actually was the afterglow related to that gravitational. So that is how we could take those three pieces of information and understand that we actually are studying one object which did all of this. And that allowed us to figure out a lot of details. Right? So what did we actually learn from this event? Why am I talking about just one event for so long? This event has been a treasure trove of discoveries for us. Okay, so right now, today, it has been 1,138 days since the event, and there are almost 1,200 papers published. So when scientists make a discovery, they write up what is called a paper, and we publish it in peer-reviewed journals. So even today, there is on an average more than one paper being written per day on this subject. Okay, one per day. That's a lot. And that is because we are still, as we analyze data, we are understanding a lot of new things about the source. Okay, so the first thing I talked about was R process elements. So if you plot how much of an element is present in the universe as a function of its atomic mass number, okay, this is where the lanthanides are and so on. We expect these second and third peak elements with these atomic numbers to be mainly created anywhere in the universe. The main source of creating them is the merger of neutron stars. And then when I showed you spectra like these with these tiny wiggles and bumps that we see, we analyzed this data and we analyzed how the source was fading with time. And we could actually conclusively show what looks like noise here means a lot to us, by the way. And we could conclusively show that our process elements were actually created there. So we are now completely sure, and by we it means not just our group, the international scientific community with many, many independent groups working on this is completely sure that these elements were actually created and that these are important sites in the universe for creating such elements. The second thing that I talked about was equation of state. So let me describe a little bit of terminology here. Okay, if I take a ball of some material and I push on it, if I squish it, okay, if it gets squished, it means that by application of pressure, the density changed a lot, and that is called a soft equation of state. On the other hand, if the density really doesn't change much, okay, if I were holding, say, some solid iron ball or something and I try to press it, it won't change in size, it won't change its volume by much. So that is called a stiff equation of state. And before 2017, we already knew from the heaviest neutron stars that had been discovered that the equation of state, or the EOS, is not too soft. And based on the results from LIGO, we could actually rule out that the equation of state is not very hard either. So we have this very specific region. I won't go into the details of what this lambda 1 and lambda 2 and so on is, but just one discovery, one set of observations so far has given us results already about what the very nature of matter is at its very core. Now, this was possible because the campaign, the follow-up campaign that happened here, the number of astronomers that were involved was probably the most concentrated and largest effort in studying a single object in astrophysics that was ever done. The final paper that was published, the main paper with this result, had more than 3,500 authors, including about 1,000 people who were responsible for making LIGO work, and people from more than or about 1,000 different institutes were involved in it. Massive effort that happened, and all of this with just one object. So how did we study all of this? I told you some of the results. So now let us look at the tools that we actually use in order to get those results. Okay, so the first thing that you need, of course, is a great team. So here's my group of students currently in our lab at IIT Bombay. Just say hi, everyone. Hi. And we are working on various aspects with various different telescopes and so on. So on the ground, here's a set of different optical, infrared, and radio telescopes. So the green hexagons are radio telescopes in the country. Red circles are optical and infrared telescopes. We have sites in Hanle. This is where the Growth India telescope is. There are telescopes in Nainital. There are telescopes at Mount Abu. There's one at Giravli. Then there are telescopes in Kavlur between Chennai and Bangalore. We also have partnership in telescopes abroad. For example, IUCA is a partner. IUCA is an institute in Pune, and that's a partner in the 10-meter telescope called Southern African Large Telescope. So let me talk to you about the Growth India telescope in particular. Okay, the object that we were studying was varying quite rapidly. Okay, now if you have a source, if I see something in the sky out there right now, I start looking at it, in a few hours that object is going to set. Or maybe the object is not visible right at sunset, it will rise late. And of course, I have to stop observations when the sun rises again. So a typical ground-based optical telescope will get 4 or 5 hours on an object over the year. On a random night through the year, right? On some nights we will not see it at all. On some nights we might see it for 8 to 10 hours. But if you think of this, suppose as shown in this slide, the sun is down here and the earth is spinning, then what is happening is that the different parts of earth are actually passing in and out of daylight, and there's always night somewhere, and that is a very important part. So what we did was that we people from about 8 different countries got together and we set up this collaboration called GROWTH, which stands for Global Relay of Observatories Watching Transients Happen. That's quite a mouthful, right? And you would thought that SHIELD and Hydra and so on, Marvel acronyms for something. Astronomers are great at this. Okay, so typically the way we work is that we have a telescope called ZTF, the Zwicky Transient Facility, and when that discovers a transient, as that object starts setting there, we hand it off to the next partner observatory like a relay race. So from California, we go to Hawaii, from there we go to Japan, then Taiwan, India, Israel, then we have telescopes here in the Canary Islands and then going back to the US. So we can actually do continuous monitoring of objects. One such campaign which we did most recently on 21st of September, we had 2 telescopes in the US, one in Taiwan and one in India, teamed up to observe an asteroid continuously for about 17, 18 hours, and we are now processing all of that data. Now, as a part of this growth collaboration, we actually set up a new telescope in India, which is the country's first fully robotic research telescope. Okay, we have gone for too long a time without pretty pictures. So let me show you this telescope. So this has a 70 centimeter aperture. Those of you who are used to photography may know these terms, but there is a mirror over here, and that mirror is about 70 centimeters in size. And we have a very high quality camera on that. 4K means it is a 16 megapixel camera. Now, some of you may say that, okay, my mobile phone has a better camera than this. Well, this camera costs about 1,000 times more than a typical cell phone camera. And the reason for that is extremely sensitive, extremely sensitive camera. It allows us to get very, very high quality images. And with this telescope, it allows us a field of view that is much wider, about a factor of 10 wider than typical research telescope field of views. So we can image largest parts of the sky in one shot. So here's the site itself. This is our dome on this beautiful site in Ladakh at Hanle. The peak that this is situated is called Dipkara Sare. This is about 50 kilometers or so from the border with China. Here is a nighttime picture. You can see that the dome is open. There is some light inside. Usually when we are observing, we don't want any sources of light inside. But this was taken during commissioning. You have already seen a very nice time lapse. Here are here's a photo inside the dome. Here's the telescope and there's the eyepiece because we were doing some calibration, some control computers and so on. Some pictures taken. This is what we call first light. The first night that we actually operated the telescope and took some images. So here's a cluster of stars. Here is a nebula. You can see all the gas that is spread around. Some of you may notice that there seems to be a horizontal straight line here. This is because this is completely raw, unprocessed image, and with basic processing that we do where we correct for some of the effects in the camera, these things completely disappear and we get good quality data that we can actually quantify. Here's another image. You may have seen a different version of it, which is usually in blue and yellow, called Pillars of Creation. And the Hubble picture of this is very, very popular. This is called the Eagle Nebula. Okay, so that's it for some pretty pictures, and that's what we do from the ground. What else can we do? How about going to space? So today is actually a very special day. Today is the 5th anniversary of the launch of AstroSat. So AstroSat is India's own multi-wavelength space telescope. It comprises of 5 different telescopes. It's a full observatory. There's SXT, which is a soft X-ray telescope. There's a ultraviolet and optical imaging telescope. There's another X-ray telescope, which these 3 boxes over here. There's a high energy X-ray telescope called Cadmium Zinc Telluride Imager. And then on the side, there is a 5th telescope, which while 4 of these telescopes actually are pointing upward, pointing at some object in the sky. Remember that in space, up down has no meaning. So we are pointing to different targets as need be. SSM actually looks at the rest of the sky and it rotates and scans and keeps monitoring the sky to search for more explosions or anything that is changing in brightness. So AstroSat was launched exactly 5 years ago today. In fact, ISRO had a nice meeting today, which has just ended. And if you go to ISRO's Facebook page, it was actually broadcast live for everyone. I hope that they will also share the recorded videos again. So you can go to ISRO's Facebook page and check it out later. If you want to know more about AstroSat itself, then here's a URL, astrosat.iuca.in, and you will find out more details about AstroSat over there. So AstroSat has been able to discover more than 300 such explosive gamma ray events to date, not once associated with gravitational waves, but just gamma ray bursts. Okay, in 5 years, we have seen more than 300. So you would think that AstroSat would have detected this event as well, but unfortunately we did not. So we said, okay, something is weird. We looked at data that Fermi and integral satellites obtained, and the event really was bright enough that AstroSat should have seen it very, very easily. So why did we not see it? Okay, so this diagram on the left is plotting a part of the sky, and there are some zoom ins and so on. But what you see is in this green patch, okay, roughly where my laser pointer is placed now is where the source of the gravitational waves was finally found. And this circle over here is the part of the sky that was hidden behind Earth as seen from AstroSat. AstroSat orbits the Earth every 98 minutes. It's about 650 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. And at any given point of time, we see about 71% of the sky, about 29% of the sky is hidden behind Earth. And this one, unfortunately, was hidden just behind Earth. So AstroSat did not see it. But is that the end of the story? I've so far kept talking about just one. But afterwards, when LIGO started observing again, it actually saw a lot more. Okay, every green dot here on this graph, there's a lot happening, so don't go into the details. But the green dots over in this graph over here are all um announcements made by the gravitational wave collaboration LIGO and Virgo, saying this could actually be a neutron star merger, a binary neutron star merger. And all the space telescopes in the world actually followed up on this, and we found nothing. And that now is a little bit worrying, right? Why did we not see it? Turns out these events were further away, and all the telescopes that we have are just not sensitive enough to detect X-rays and gamma rays coming from these objects. So what do we do? Well, we clearly need to do something bigger. Okay, so what are the requirements if we want to detect events like this? The first thing is that we need to be about 10 times more sensitive than existing telescopes. Okay, that means you make a telescope with a larger area, lower noise, reject backgrounds, you need to process data better, and so on. The second thing you want is a very wide spectral band, because you don't know if the source is going to emit mainly X-rays, mainly gamma rays. Not just that, the radiation you detect, okay, looking at the spectrum of that radiation, looking at how many soft X-rays and how much was emitted in hard X-rays, how much was emitted in gamma rays, that actually tells you what is happening at the source. It tells you what kind of physics is going on there. Why is the light being emitted? And that in turn again helps us understand what kind of elements are being created, how are jets being launched, most extreme scenarios in the universe. The third thing is we don't want an astrosat like unfortunate thing again. 300 seconds, okay, in 300 seconds that source Earth came out from behind Earth, but that was too late. The blip lasted for about 1.3 seconds. It was 1.7 seconds after the merger. The duration was about 1.3, which means that you need continuous all sky coverage, and you can't clearly look through Earth. So what you need is two satellites on opposite sides of the Earth. With all of this in mind, we actually have proposed a project to ISRO, which is called Daksha. So Daksha is going to be, Daksha of course means alert, and it's going to be a mission which we have proposed, which has two satellites that will scan the sky continuously for these kind of high energy transient events, whether these are counterparts to gravitational wave sources or whether they are conventional gamma ray bursts or anything else. Okay, so Daksha is going to, each satellite is going to have three types of detectors. There will be low energy, medium, and high energy detectors. These medium energy detectors work in roughly the same energy range as the conventional X-rays that you think of. So if you have a baggage scanner at a railway station or an airport, or if you are going to a hospital to get an X-ray taken, then that's the energy range that we are talking about. Okay, and then we will also be able to detect gamma rays, and these two satellites put together are actually going to do wonders. Why? So let's look at some numbers here. Okay, so far there has been exactly one event, as I said, where gravitational waves plus corresponding electromagnetic counterparts were discovered. When Daksha is launched, we will actually be able to detect a few dozen such events every year. Okay, in 5 years, we will detect between 50 to 100 such events in comparison with one event in the last 3 years. The second thing is that I said that there are other events called gamma ray bursts, and Astrosat has detected about 300 of them spread over 5 years. But if you take all the satellites that are out there right now, the NIRGAL, Swift Observatory, Fermi, CALET, HXMT, Astrosat, everything put together, we detect about 350 such bursts every year. With Daksha, the two Daksha satellites by themselves will detect about 1,000 such events per year. And it was very difficult to actually calculate this number. It took us about 2 months to calculate this number because nobody has detected bursts which are so faint. So nobody has any idea, any concrete idea about how many faint bursts there are. So we had to have a lot of discussions with observers, with theorists, and try to figure out, okay, how many on our current best estimates based on what we understand about the bright events, how many faint events should be there. And in addition to that, there is actually a very interesting thing that we can do. If we detect a burst, okay, we can inform LIGO or Virgo or the gravitational wave detectors. LIGO India, for instance, should be up by then. And we can actually tell them, hey, we saw an explosion in that part of the sky at this time, which looks like a gravitation, that it could be related to a gravitational wave event. And then LIGO can do a specialized search in that part of the data. And when we do these so-called triggered searches, you can actually get better quality of data. Okay, so LIGO is always gathering data. It doesn't have to be repointed to that part of the sky, but by doing specialized analysis, they might be able to find bursts there even if they had missed them before. And based on this, we think that we can actually boost the number of events that LIGO itself can detect, neutron star events. Remember, black holes, we won't see anything like this. And now if you think of it, that is quite amazing. We are talking of using light. We are talking about using X-rays and gamma rays to tell a gravitational wave detector that there should be events there. And with that, we should be able to improve the efficiency and how much they can detect. So what is the status of Daksha? Well, Daksha is a project that has been proposed to the Indian Space Research Organization. IIT Bombay, our team here is the lead team, but we are working very, very closely with the Physical Research Laboratory in Ahmedabad, TIFR in Mumbai, Ayuka in Pune, RRI in Bangalore, and various ISRO centers all over the country. We have teams working on the science aspects, building detectors, designing the satellite, fabricating it. And ISRO, based on its study of a lot of proposals, they have actually shortlisted us for further development. They have given us some seed funding to demonstrate a proof of concept. And if we actually show them that proof of concept, then they will consider us for a full mission. So it is still in the advanced proposal stage. All right, that brings me to the last part of my talk. I talked about electromagnetic counterparts of gravitational wave events. There are 3 functional gravitational wave detectors around the world right now, 2 LIGO detectors in the US. By the way, a lot of people read LIGO and call it LIGO. It's not how it's to be pronounced. It's called LIGO. So 2 LIGOs in the US and there's Virgo in Italy. But soon LIGO India is expected to be coming up. LIGO, this is actually a picture from the site, by the way. Why worry about LIGO India? So here's one example. This is a simulation that we did based on the first ever event detected, GW150914. So the 2 US detectors put together identified this gray blob in the sky, saying that the source was located somewhere in this. If another event like this happens and LIGO India is functional at that point, then we will be able to point it to such a small region, which is about 100 times smaller. Okay, so this is just one of the many advantages that LIGO India gives. Having a detector that is located almost opposite to the 2 detectors in the US has immense advantages. And I'm sure that Shomak Raychaudhuri will have covered some of them in his talk last week. So you could go back and look at that talk to see more about this. And memorandum of understanding has actually been signed between India and the US so that we will build this with the help of US. The PM actually announced this at the Honorable Prime Minister announced this at the Indian Science Congress, saying that we have given a full go ahead to establish this 3rd detector in India. We started by surveying a lot of sites all over the country. You have to find the requirements are quite stringent. You want a site which is earthquake free. You don't want vibrations because they will displace things. Remember, we are trying to measure small displacements of mirrors. So you can't be too close to the ocean because waves hitting the shore actually shake the ground. We can't sense it, but we are trying. These detectors are trying to measure things which are 1,000 times smaller than a proton. You can't be next to a very busy industrial site. You can't be close to a very large city. At the same time, you don't want it to be such a remote place that you cannot actually carry material there for construction. Or if you are having international experts visit, then the site should remain accessible. So we did a seismic survey at a lot of places, and then we need 2 arms which are 4 kilometers wide, long, perpendicular to each other. So it can't be a very hilly region. But yes, the site was selected. Since I'm part of the LIGO outreach team, I'm actually not going to name the site here because what I want you to do instead is go look it up. But just as a teaser, here is a picture of the LIGO India building that has been set up in a town near the site. And LIGO is a highly multidisciplinary project. Okay, so at LIGO India, okay, if you keep LIGO India at the core, of course, there's a LIGO scientific collaboration, but in green boxes here is what you would think of as conventional astrophysics. So you have X-ray and UV, radio, gamma ray, neutrino astronomy working with it. The yellow boxes at the top are theoretical physics, so whether it is general theory of relativity or quantum gravity and so on. Then the orange box is a mix of engineering and physics. So we want to do these highly precision measurements, very fundamental tests about the nature of space-time, nature of gravity. And then here we have engineering technologies, okay, quantum metrology, laser physics. The most stable lasers ever built by humanity are the lasers that exist in the LIGO detectors. And then you expect spin-offs to come from those, right? The improvements in laser technology that are being made for LIGO, we never know what they might lead to. Maybe next time you go for an eye surgery, maybe in 10 years, the lasers that are used for LASIK surgery might actually be improved thanks to technologies developed in LIGO. Vacuum technology, this is the largest high vacuum ever created in the world. So to be able to create this vacuum, you can't even use normal pumps, because what a pump does is it takes a volume of air, pushes it out, and then you open a valve, you let air flow in again. But the vacuum used here is so high that there's hardly any air left to flow in. So you have to use very different technologies to pump out air from the LIGO so if there's any air, if there's a single speck of dust falling in the chamber, then that can actually completely mess up the measurements that are being done. Optical engineering, the quality of the mirror surface and the kind of coatings that are needed on it is immense engineering challenge in itself. Sensor technologies, there are hundreds of sensors that are spread around the LIGO detectors to measure the environment. We need to be aware of everything. We need to know if there were any vibrations coming from outside. We need to know if temperatures change. Even gusts of wind pushing against the pipes that you saw in the earlier flyby, that can change our measurements. There are all these stories about there was some weird spike that was regularly being seen in one of the detectors in the US detectors. And eventually it was found that it was a fridge whose stabilizer was not working properly. And every time someone opened the door, in a little bit, the fridge, actually the compressor had to start again, because it had to start cooling things in the fridge again. And that was causing some noise on the electrical line, which was which was showing up in our data. In one case, there was a standard stand fan which was just vibrating too much, okay, and those vibrations were getting coupled with the detectors. So extremely precise measurements, and then of course closed loop control systems. So there are a lot of engineering applications that are going. And then if you look at computing, Ayuka is actually in Pune setting up a supercomputing facility specially for LIGO. The amount of data that is generated and the amount of processing that has to be done is immense. So there are a lot of developments that are being done in computing and in storage and so on to be able to handle all of this. Right. So if you are interested in LIGO, if all of this is fascinating to you, then from any of these fields, you have an opportunity to come together and contribute to LIGO. Now, specifically for students, I would like to add one more thing here, that even students with an engineering background have two options of getting involved. You could actually switch your fields and come into astrophysics, or you can continue along engineering areas and still get involved in LIGO. Okay, so go to the LIGO India website and you can find out what institutes are involved, reach out to more people and find out more. Okay, so I will leave you with this. We are active on social media. We have internship programs that are run every year. Unfortunately, we couldn't do one this year due to COVID-19. But any positions that are available in LIGO, all of these details are advertised on the website and on social media channels. So do go there, and that is the best place for you to go interact with LIGO. We have just had two extremely successful lecture series where we had senior scientists from India and from all over the world giving talks. This was called Gravitational Waves at Home with LIGO India, GWHLI. All those talks are available online for free. And you can get to hear all of them. So I will leave you with this, and we can take questions.
So thank you, sir, for that. Let's start with the questions. So a lot of this question initially had a lot of people who were asking in our porting actually. So it was actually about pinpointing the sources of the gravitational waves.
Okay.
So how do we actually pinpoint the exact location? Like, we are not able to pinpoint the exact location maybe. So what is the process involved there?
Okay, so the way your ears actually function in order to localize a source is very similar to how LIGO does it. Okay, so how does your, if you close your eyes and if you hear some sound, how does your brain process it? How do you know where it came from? And depending on the frequency of sound, there are two ways in which your brain can do this. Okay, the first is that if you have sound which is of short wavelength, then what your brain does is it actually measures the delay between the sound being audible to one ear from one ear to the other. Okay, and based on this delay, if the source is located here, then your right ear will hear it before the left one. If it is in front of you, then both ears will hear it together. If it is to the left, then left before right. If it is a longer wavelength source, then your brain actually does a lot of advanced signal processing without ever telling you. It looks at the phase difference between the source. And these are both techniques which are used by LIGO as well. Okay, and that is why having a detector in India is very important. So a gravitational wave travels at the speed of sound and it can pass through all of Earth, no problems at all. So imagine a gravitational wave coming from, say, on top of India. It would hit the LIGO India detector and it would take something like 30 to 35 milliseconds before it was incident on the LIGO US detectors. Okay, so with three detectors spread somewhere on Earth, you can actually locate the source to two lobes or 2 points on the sky. And having 4 or 5 detectors actually has some advantages. You get redundancy, which allows you to eliminate noise, and your localization keeps getting better and better. So what we do is a gravitational wave signal actually looks like this. Where do we have it? Right here. No, here. Okay, so here is an example waveform of a gravitational wave source. And I'm going to let this go forward a bit more and then pause it. Okay, so you see this waveform, the intensity or the amplitude, not intensity, the amplitude of the gravitational wave as a function of time has a very specific format. It's called a chirp. And what is happening is that the amplitude is increasing as you go closer to the merger itself, and the frequency is also increasing. The wavelength or the span between these peaks here is decreasing as you go closer and closer. Okay, and now this signal, suppose this signal like this was measured at LIGO Hanford, what you would measure at LIGO Livingston will have a small offset from this, and then what you measure at Virgo will have an offset. Kagra coming up in Japan will have an offset. LIGO India will have an offset, and where the source is on the sky will decide where exactly these signals lie. So that uh, inverting that problem is how we figure out where a source is located on the sky. Next question.
Harshad, you are muted. Unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. So actually, one person from LIGO Australia has also joined us, Siddharth S. Verma. So he's talking about some very recent impossible black hole detection merger, like impossible black hole merger detection. So what have we actually learned
Okay.
from?
Okay, here I think I should go back and quote Arthur Conan Doyle, or the person he pretended to be. I'm quoting Sherlock Holmes. Okay, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how unlikely, must be the truth. Okay, so it clearly happened, so it wasn't impossible. Okay, so very recently, you may have read about this in papers. We announced an event called 190521, GW 190521, which was a merger of two black holes. And the remnant that was created was quite heavy. It was somewhere between 100 to 200 times heavier than the sun. Now, the issue here is that the two black holes which merged themselves were quite heavy. They were more than 50 solar masses, closer to 100. Now, the way you create a black hole, okay, what we broadly call stellar mass black holes, is you have a very, very massive star, maybe 100 times heavier than the sun, maybe 50 times heavier than the sun. And at the end of its life, it explodes as a supernova. The outermost shells get thrown out and ejected into space. The innermost part gets compressed into a black hole. Okay. Typically, we expect this to create black holes between say 5 to 20 times the mass of the sun. Now, if you see a black hole if you see this event, then you're talking about 60, 70 solar mass black holes. They cannot have been formed, as far as we understand, from supernovae directly. So that is why people have some people have given it the unfortunate name of impossible event. So where did we get these two black holes? And how did that merger happen? So there are various possibilities. It is possible that the event actually started off one of these events where you have two black holes of comparable masses. They merged and created those 60, 70 solar mass black holes, and then two of those merged. So that is called a hierarchical merger scheme. It is possible that uh, what are called population 3 stars, which is an ironic name, they are the first stars in the universe. We don't very well understand those stars. So it is possible that these stars may at their deaths have created these extremely massive black holes. It is also possible that there is some mistake or some shortcoming, I wouldn't call it a mistake, some shortcoming in our understanding of very massive stellar formation and evolution. And it is possible that maybe there are ways to create those massive black holes directly from the collapse of a star. So we don't fully understand how those black holes would have been formed. It is clear that they were formed in the universe and they merged and then they formed an even more massive black hole. Now, we also know about black holes which are millions to billions of times heavier than the sun. Okay, the center of our own Milky Way has a black hole which is about 4 million times heavier than the sun. Some of you may remember something called the Event Horizon Telescope, which quote unquote photographed a black hole, or to be more precise, photographed stuff around the black hole. And that was looking at a nearby galaxy where the black hole is a few billion times heavier than the sun. Those again we understand how to form, and those just grow by accreting stuff, by gobbling up other stuff and merging with other heavy black holes and so on. But this there was a gap in between at few hundred solar masses to just under a million solar masses. We didn't know of any black holes of that size, and there was no reason to believe they shouldn't exist. We just hadn't seen any. And this event was the first time that we got a confirmed detection of the existence of one of them.
So I mean, we will always be able to produce a model regarding that as well. So
Well, and hopefully when we see more such systems, okay, the first detection is something which you look at it and you go, wow. And then as you start seeing more and more, then patterns emerge. And then you start understanding, oh, wait a minute, maybe this one was weird. Maybe it was an extremely rare event. But if we see in the next LIGO observing run, if we see 5 more of those, then that is telling you something. Maybe something is wrong in our understanding of the universe rather than the event itself. So that is discovery, and that is the scientific process happening as you watch it happen.
right. So next few questions, I'll club them because they're regarding the models essentially. So how robust do we feel our theoretical models are for like black hole mergers or neutron star mergers? So like we can give a proper structure to the signal what we expect. So how robust are those models and are we getting those results?
Very robust. Okay, the gravitational wave signals are so weak that we use a technique called matched filtering. Okay, so we look for the kind of signal that you expect, and then that is how we find the signal. For example, if you are sitting in, say, if you are in a forest, okay, and in the morning you are hearing lots of different birds tweeting and twittering, rather, not tweeting. Anyway, you're hearing all these bird sounds, and I ask you what all birds do you hear, you might not be able to list out everything. But if I now change the question and I ask you, hey, do you hear a crow among all those birds? Then you have an idea about what the crow sounds like. And then you will be able to tell me more confidently saying, yeah, I hear a crow or I don't hear a crow. Right? Same thing is true with sounds of cars. Okay, for people, or with airplanes, this is quite an hobby. With there are people who can hear the sound of an airplane and tell you what plane actually is making that sound, and the way they know that is they have seen that plane make that sound a lot of times before. Okay, so we made theoretical models and we did numerical simulations and we calculated how this waveform should be like. And extremely fundamental contributions in very early stages of these were made by Indian scientists, by the way. There is something called the ring down phase, or the quasi-static oscillations or something. Okay, the ring down phase of a black hole merger, after the black hole is formed, it actually oscillates a little bit, rings like a bell. And that prediction was made by Indian scientists. Some of the very first calculations of these signals, these waveforms that you are seeing on screen right now, they were made by an Indian scientist. Some of the very first, so that was a group by of Bala Iyer and others, by the way. So the very mathematical proof that this kind of match filtering will allow us to detect these signals was done by Sanjeev Dhurandhar and his group. So Indians have been involved in this for several decades now, right at the forefront. And the very fact that matched template searches gave us match filter searches from these templates gave us detections of black holes tells you that our calculations were extremely robust. And we have done various kind of tests on this. Okay, so if you see a waveform like this, what we do is we split it into different parts and we say, okay, if we analyze the first part of the waveform, and from that let's try to calculate the properties of the system, the masses of the black holes and the separations and whatever. And then let's independently take the second part of the waveform and redo the analysis. Are the answers consistent with each other? And it turns out that in all the experiments we have done so far, they are. There are also different groups doing this analysis independently. There are groups outside the LIGO collaboration, which after a certain amount of time, LIGO collaboration makes the data public, LIGO Virgo collaborations, and there are groups outside which have analyzed it and they've found the same results. We have done tests. All of these numerical simulations are based on general theory of relativity, and we have done various tests of general theory of relativity, saying, okay, let us add other free parameters. Let us see what if, just as for example, in the world around you, you don't need to use relativity to figure out, to understand daily life, right? If you are watching IPL and you see a batsman hitting a six, you mentally know where the ball is going to go based on your intuition, which in turn the calculations could be done with just Newton's laws. You don't have to start by writing Einstein's equations to figure out where the ball falls. Although strictly speaking, the motion of the ball is governed by relativity. So we can say, okay, Newton's laws are excellent approximation of relativity for day-to-day life. Okay, maybe the general theory of relativity itself is an approximation of something else, or maybe it is the final theory. We don't know yet. So we say, okay, what if we allow small deviations from Einstein's theory of relativity, and then we test for those deviations. And again, so far, we have not seen any evidence of any deviations. So all of this put together, we are at this stage extremely confident that our understanding of these waveforms is extremely robust.
Yeah. So gravitational waves is one of the things we are looking, which have really good match between theoretical and practical.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
So next few people have asked about actually the gamma ray burst, and this is something I also had a doubt about actually. Mm-hmm. So in the graph you showed about, detection of the actual gravitational wave and the gamma ray burst, there was a 1.7 second or something, 2 seconds delay. So why is that delay there?
That's a very good question. So let's actually look at, not to go through all the slides again, let's jump to this. Okay, so this offset that you are talking about. Now, one possibility is that maybe the speed of light and gravity are different. Okay, but this coincidence already tells us this event happened 130 million years ago. Okay, so 1.2 seconds, 1.7 seconds over that is 1 part in 10 raised to minus 15 or something like that. 1 part in 10 raised to 15 or something like that. Okay, so this actually proved that gravitational waves travel at the speed of light. But now let us look at this animation that I had about a merger of neutron stars. Okay, and let us look at this again carefully. Okay, so I have neutron stars which are spiraling in. They're maybe emitting radio X-ray. We did not detect those. They're too far away. They might have just been too faint. And now the merger happened. And after the merger, you are seeing that the cloud is spreading out. Okay, so at the instant of the merger, Okay, what is happening is that the volume that is emitting light, the surface that is emitting light is just too small. This continues to brighten over time. Plus, the outermost material is actually opaque to light, and it takes some time for the material to spread out enough that light is being emitted, but the outer material is blocking it. When it spreads out, light can actually escape through that. So it's a combination of these two factors that decides when the emission actually peaks. Okay, in this particular case, our group favors a model called a cocoon model, where what is happening is that these jets that you see here, these jets were pointed away from Earth, and we have been able to measure this. There was an angle of something like 25 degrees away from Earth. And what is happening is that all of this material which was thrown out, the jets actually had to shoot through that material, and in doing so, they exchange some energy. Okay, think of it as if you are blasting water on sand. Okay, so the sand is going to start moving because of your jet of water, and or even if it is water in water itself, it's going to set up all these eddies and ripples, and all of that then heated up this material along the side, and that emitted gamma rays which we saw. The other part where you have to have a surface that is actually large enough, some of you who enjoy firecrackers might have noticed this in Diwali or probably with your IPL firecrackers. You will actually see and hear a firecracker at slightly different times. The sound is made at the explosion itself when the paper gets ripped apart, but the flash can actually appear momentarily later, and that is because hot gas is expanding, and only when it is large enough is when it actually appears brightest to you, and then after that it starts cooling, so it fades down again. So any explosion, there's a period of brightening, then there's peak brightness, and then it starts fading. And in this particular case also, you see that in the light curve itself there is a peaking and then a falling off. Plus, there's an offset which had to do with this energy being transmitted to the material that we saw. So the collision is not emitting the gamma rays. The collision has thrown out material, and processes, fusion happening in that material is emitting the gamma rays. So very good observation, good question.
So we have a little bit overshoot about our time. So can we extend a bit more?
Sure, we can go ahead for some more time.
So next question I have is about all those phenomena of gravitational wave, like phenomena which might emit gravitational waves which we have not actually observed. So that includes supernovae, triple mergers, or even the Big Bang. So how do we are planning to detect?
So triple mergers are something which we are computationally limited right now, but also the probability of a triple merger is much lower. So we don't actually expect to detect a triple merger anytime soon. The so-called stochastic background of gravitational waves comes from two parts. It is the sum total of all the sources that you cannot resolve. So for example, if you are standing on a railway station, if you hear noise, then that noise is a combination of two things. Okay, or if you are in your classroom after the lecture ends, okay, one part of noise is sources which you otherwise knew, but there are just too many of them and they are confusing you, right? People talking. If one person talks, it's a lecture. If everyone talks, it's noise. Plus, there are unknown components of noise where, oh, there is some sound coming from somewhere. I don't know what the source of that sound was. Okay, so the stochastic background similarly consists of all these events which are happening throughout the universe, sum total of their gravitational waves, plus there could be gravitational waves from the Big Bang itself. And it is not clear if LIGO itself will be able to detect the component. Maybe we need space-based interferometers like LISA. Then there are other sources I mentioned include supernovae. So supernovae are relatively weak sources of gravitational waves, and we will need a supernova in our own galaxy for any chance of it to be detectable. And we haven't had a supernova in our galaxy for during the age of modern astronomy. The youngest ones we know are a few hundred years old. Sorry, go ahead.
Maybe Betelgeuse is next.
Maybe Betelgeuse is next. We don't know. It could be. In that sense, astrophysics is a very peculiar experimental science. Okay, it is a science. It is completely based on experiment. It is a physical science, but we have no control on our experiment. I cannot actually walk up to a neutron star and say, hey, "Chal collide ho ja." I cannot go and light a fuse on a star and tell it to blow up as a supernova. right? We just have to observe what nature gives us, and that too we observe it from far away, from only one angle and only once. So it makes it extremely challenging. Think of it as if you are doing a chemistry lab, okay? But instead of having your test tubes in your hand and trying to do the reaction, I actually make you stand on the other end of campus, look through the window into the chemistry lab, and just by looking at the test tube, you have to tell me what is the reaction going on, how long has it been going on, is it endothermic, exothermic, what are the materials that were created, and all of that. Right? So it's an extremely challenging field from that perspective.
We have just got by chance all these events that are here, but we might want to like, if we increase our sensitivity, we might be even able to get even more events.
Exactly.
So regarding all this sensitivity and all, so there's a question about observation. So the growth project you had told about all the telescopes in growth project. So the pattern seemed to be that all of them were in the northern hemisphere.
Correct. So growth was first set up as a collaboration of institutes and telescopes in the northern hemisphere. We did not have enough partners who could give a massive coverage of the southern hemisphere, and there were other projects which were doing that. We have slowly expanded since. We have been using some telescopes that are located in Chile. We last year took on a new partner in Australia. So now there are various partners in the southern hemisphere also. And so yes, we now have increased reach there. In addition, we also use space telescopes where northern southern doesn't make as much of a difference. So I would, for those interested, I would suggest you go to growth.caltech.edu or you look up the Growth India Telescope and you will find details about what our partner institutes are and so on.
Right. So we'll be able to get all the events that
Oh, by the way, one more point here is that growth is one of the collaborations. There are others like LCOGT and Grandma and so on. As I said, growth is just one acronym, right? There are actually projects. There's one project called Grandma, and these are all also massive networks of telescopes around the world, which are involved in such follow-up.
So another question is a little bit more practical about. So one quick person just straight away asked, why are we detecting gravitational waves?
Excellent question. Let's see. All of you are presumably sitting at home because of lockdown. So let me ask a question. How many of you have actually ordered any kind of delivery at home? It might be your Flipkart or Amazon, or it might be your Big Basket, or it might be Swiggy or whatever. Okay, I'm assuming that most of you have. Now, the way that person knows where to come to give you a delivery is because your phone has a little thing called a GPS in it. GPS is a global positioning system that works on by using satellites in orbit around the Earth, and you pick up signals from those satellites, and your phone can then calculate where it is on Earth. Now, it turns out that for this GPS signal to work, you actually need to have special theory of relativity and general theory of relativity both. Now, when Einstein was working on the theory of relativity in 1905, he clearly was not thinking of creating an effective mechanism of ordering pizza at home. Einstein was curious about the nature of space-time, and in doing so, he actually understood something fundamental about how the universe works. And 100 years later, people actually figured out how that fundamental nature of the universe can actually allow us to stay at home while others are helping us actually effectively fight this pandemic, right? Or in normal times, we have figured out how to be extremely lazy and order food at home. Einstein was not after this. Okay, so all of physics, all of science in some sense, but physics and astrophysics in particular is a quest of origins. It is about finding out our place in the universe. It is about understanding who we are, where we came from, where are we going. It's about understanding the world around us. Humanity has moved so far ahead of the rest of the animal kingdom because of this inherent curious nature that we have. And this is the next step. Who knows, maybe in 100 years, we might have spacecraft which are propelled by gravitational waves, and we are actually a species that can travel across the galaxy. No idea. Right now, when we are doing this, this is fundamental research. For example, again, the laptops that you are using, probably your phones or whatever, are all working on electronic chips, which in turn came out from someone playing around with electronic circuits, trying to figure out what happens to electrons when I apply a transverse electric field during their motion, and then eventually it led to vacuum tubes, and then to transistors, and then all of integrated circuits. So fundamental research progresses like this. But if that answer is not enough, there is also this other part of what actually consists of LIGO, right? So if we come to this part, as I mentioned, the world's most stable lasers were created for this endeavor. The best high vacuum systems, some of the most intensive computational systems, a lot of different algorithms, all of these things, seismic isolation. Okay, so maybe technologies that we are developing here might give us better earthquake proof buildings in a decade or two. Okay, so all of these things. Now you might say, okay, if I want to make better lasers, why not make better lasers? Turns out that's not how creativity works. And without creativity, science cannot progress. You have to take some problem, start working on it, and you keep finding things. And the better you understand the universe, the better you can be a part of it, the better you can utilize it, and the better you can actually fit in without screwing with the universe. That is why we are doing all of this.
Yeah. Even if we and when we are able to use the current technologies, give us even more like 30 years or 20 years, people will be able to see the impact of this.
Maybe.
Right. So a lot of people have asked about the implications of quantum mechanics in gravity. So is the energy of gravitational waves quantized or something like that?
That is a very, very interesting question. And the short answer is we have no idea. Okay, quantum mechanics has been an extremely successful theory in describing the very small of the universe. Gravity, general theory of relativity, has been extremely successful in describing the very large. And um, the interface has been problematic, and it has been elusive for more than a century. Uh, Gravitational waves, by the way, are one place where we are using a lot of quantum techniques to detect gravitational waves. Okay, there are effects like squeezing of light, and we are worried about quantum noise and so on. So we are using it. And LIGO mirrors are tens of kilos in weight, and they are actually macroscopic quantum objects. We see quantum mechanical effects on those heavy, large mirrors. But while all of this is happening, we really are not yet sure how gravity will get quantized. Is gravity quantized at all? Are there gravitons? We really still don't know. For those of you who are listening to this right now, maybe some of you will solve this. You can go ahead and become scientists, and you might be able to solve this in your lifetime. Lot of people working on it, but progress is happening slowly. There has not been any breakthrough on this front.
Yeah, this will be a Nobel Prize winning answer question to solve essentially. So I think as the last question, I would like to ask about all the opportunities we have as students and all the materials and all the content LIGO can provide. So what are those?
Okay, so you asked about opportunities and materials. So I'll give the answer in two parts. The LIGO scientific collaboration has put out a lot of education and outreach. So I'm part of LIGO, and I'm part of the outreach and education committee of LIGO India. So we have put out the international collaboration as well as the LIGO India and Indigo collaborations. We have put out a lot of content. So there are courses that you can actually find online where you can study the engineering of LIGO, the physics of LIGO. You could either start from ligo.org or from the LIGO India site that I talked about, and from there you can find these resources. The second thing is, because we know that you are all present on social media, we've also come onto social media, and we share all of this information on social media. We recently did this very, very detailed lecture series. It is a fantastic resource. Thousands of people have actually, several of those talks have a few thousand views each. Okay, so go to our channels from there, or go to our YouTube channel, which I have not mentioned here. So if you go to YouTube, look for LIGO India, we have a channel, and there are about 24 talks given from leading experts around the world. talking about different aspects of gravitational waves, right? The engineering, the physics, the technology, everything. So that is about material. For opportunities, there are, of course, opportunities at various scales, right? We are looking for scientists to work in the LIGO India project. So there are opportunities for people to do PhDs. There are opportunities for undergraduate students to do project. There are about 10 to 20 different institutes involved in LIGO India. This website will tell you all their names. And even undergraduate students at all of these places have opportunities to work on these projects. We want to be as inclusive as possible, so we also float internship opportunities every year. Unfortunately, not this year, but usually we also send a few students abroad to work at the LIGO site so that they will get hands-on experience. So all of these opportunities, whether they are for internships or for PhD programs, postdocs, we make sure that they are actually listed on the website and as much as possible on our social media channels as well. So that is where you'll get to find out more information about this. Um, the lockdown has forced a lot of content to go online. You can actually take advantage of that, because before now, if we were to do a lecture series like this, we would host it in some city, and students in that city, probably a few hundred students, as much as a single auditorium can take, would have been able to attend those talks. But now it is limitless. All of you are welcome to take advantage from those resources. If you have more specific questions, then here's the email address, LIGO India Outreach at ayuka.in. You email us there if you have very specific queries, and we will try our best to answer them as soon as possible.
So LIGO India is providing a lot of opportunities, a wide field of opportunities for people, I must say.
Indeed, and we would really like all of you to join us in discovering the universe.
Right. Yeah. So somebody actually even asked about a very specific kind of work which is going on, neutron star merging simulations. So is that going on?
Yes, of course it is. As I said, the field was invented by Indians. Okay, the first numerical simulations were done by Bala Iyer's group, and the match filtering technique was proven by Sanjeev Dhurandar's group, and so on. There are still groups all over the country working in different forms of this. If the question is about what is called the numerical relativity simulations, I don't think they are happening in India, but there are Indians based in India and abroad who are working with international groups to do those. There is a lot of work on match filtering and so on happening here even right now. So various, I think the answer is too technical to give as a broad based answer. So I would say go to the site, see who are the people involved, and their expertise areas are also mentioned there, and then you can reach out to specific people accordingly.
So I think that's the questions we can take for now. I'd request other people to maybe connect with you later. We can provide the contact.
Sure.
Thank you for that. So I would like to call our Science and Tech Events Coordinator, Nikita, to provide the vote of thanks.
Hi. I hope I'm audible.
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Yes. So firstly, we would like to thank Professor Varun for being so kind as to accept our invitation and taking time out of his busy schedule to give us this very fascinating and educational talk on this extremely interesting field and the work being done. Thank you, Professor, for sharing with us the questions that keep you up in the night, as well as for the pretty pictures and the animation. Not only was the talk an inspiring example of the work achieved by worldwide and nationwide collaboration, but it was also enlightening about the first binary neutron star merger and what that means to us. But honestly, it felt like a chalk talk with multiple embedded jokes, and thank you again for the simply wonderful explanation of these concepts. We would also like to thank the Dean of the UG program of IISc, Professor P.S. Anil Kumar, for making this talk possible. We would like to express our heartfelt gratitude to LIGO EPO, IUCAA, and Mr. Ankit Bhandari for coordinating with the speakers and helping us in the organization and the publicity of this talk. We would like to thank the Physics Initiative in Nepal and the Astronomy and Cosmology page from Bangladesh for helping us spread word about these talks. We would like to thank Team Pravega for supporting us and helping us in the organization of this talk. A special shout out to Himanshu, who was Team Pravega's point of contact for these talks. And lastly, we would like to thank you all for attending this talk and we hope you enjoyed it. If you did, Pravega is hosting a bunch of other talks for you, which you can check out at pravega.org. I believe at this point of time there will be an announcement made with a feedback link. If you could be so kind as to fill up the feedback link, we would be grateful. As for Coherence lectures, we will be back next month, 4th October, 5 p.m. Professor Abhishek from the International Center for Theoretical Sciences, Bengaluru, will be talking about the puzzles in the theory of heat conduction in low-dimensional systems. Till then, goodbye and take care.